For the first time ever, you can now use every single card in Clash Royale in the upcoming global tournament. So today, I'm going to be showcasing the top 5 decks to use in Clash Royale right now. These are decks that have done well in both top ladder as well as in grand challenges, so you can be sure that they're going to do very well in this current meta. But before we get into the video, if you could please leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel. Also, use code Legendaray in the shop. You get the dealio. Let's get right into the decks. Number 1, Pekka Bridge Spam. Now, Pekka Bridge Spam has been meta for the longest time, and with the new Golden Knight, it's actually even better. Now, this deck is a relatively fast and aggressive style deck, but starting off the match, I will still be rather passive. And that's because a lot of the times you're gonna need specific counters to what your opponents play, so it's a little bit easier to just sort of react to what your opponents play first. So, starting off on the defensive end of this deck, of course, you have the very simple high damage output with the Pekka. The Royal Ghost, the Mother Witch, and the Golden Knight's dashing ability can be used to deal with any sort of swarm units, and the Electro Wizard and the Ram Rider are going to be your two main ways of both slowing down your opponent's pushes as well as dealing with any sort of air push that the opponent might have. Air units is actually one of the biggest weaknesses of this deck, so if you are against an air deck, that is definitely something that you're going to have to take into account. Moving on from this, the goal of any sort of defense with this deck is to have some sort of surviving units that you're going to be able to use on a counter push. This deck has quick and cheap pressure units such as the Royal Ghost and the Golden Knight, so if you have some good surviving units on defense, it's very useful to just apply some more pressure with that surviving counter push. Now, while the Royal Ghost and the Golden Knight can generally be sent in alone, I definitely would not recommend sending in the Ram Rider on her own. Not only is she such a useful defensive card, so you don't want to get her out of cycle, but she's actually also pretty weak on her own, so you generally will want to support her with several other units. Finally, if you can't break through with the traditional bridge spam approach, you can also consider building up a big beatdown push as well. Going in with a Pekka in the back, supporting her like a traditional beatdown push, and maybe even applying double lane pressure with the Pekka down one lane and your bridge spam in the other. All in all, a fast-paced and easy deck to pick up and play. Number 2, Gelatin King Mortar Cycle. Now, this is probably one of the best Skeleton King decks in Clash Royale right now. And to be honest, it's also one of the most fun to play as well. Now, this deck is all about spam. And while on the surface, it might look like this deck is very weak to just a ton of splash control, and don't get me wrong, it is, but the whole point of this deck is to literally just build up so many swarm units that the opponent simply will not be able to deal with it. Starting off the match, I'm always going to be cycling something cheap, such as the Skeleton Barrel or Spear Goblins at the bridge, or maybe some bats in the back, and I'm generally going to be trying to start the match off a little bit more aggressively and forcing my opponents to begin responding to my units. This is going to be a more chip style deck, so a lot of the times you're going to be getting little bits of damage over and over again onto your opponent's tower. Now, how effective this deck is going to be depends on two main factors: how effectively you can play the bait aspect of this deck, and how effectively you can play the Skeleton King. So with the bait aspect, of course, that's pretty obvious, right? This is at its very core a bait style deck. A lot of swarm units. You want to bait out your opponent's small spells in order to overwhelm your opponents. Secondly, these swarm units actually synergize very well with the Skeleton King, because as all of these swarm units just get disintegrated by your opponents, all of those units actually turn into souls that are collected by the Skeleton King, and when you use the ability, it's going to generate so many skeletons. Combining that with the quick pressure of the mortar, you're going to be able to build some insanely large pushes that your opponents simply will not be able to deal with. On the defensive end, this deck can be a little bit more sketchy because, you know, all of your units are very swarm based, and in those situations, you're oftentimes going to have to use the mortar to pull any sort of building targeting units, and then you're going to have to use your Skeleton King or the Skeleton Barrel as a cheap tank in order to allow some of your other swarm units to take care of the opponent's push. All in all, a fast-paced and very fun deck to play in this upcoming meta. Number 3, Mega Knight Bridge Spam. Now, moving on to the third deck, it's going to be the classic Archer Queen Mega Knight Bridge Spam deck. Now this deck has just taken this meta by storm, and its playstyle is also going to be very aggressive and fast-paced. Starting off the match, I'm pretty much just always cycling something cheap, may that be a bandit or a royal ghost or even a bar barrel at the bridge, forcing my opponents to immediately begin responding to some of my quick pressure. After that, I will generally move towards a more defensive or reactive style of play, or alternatively, if the opponent makes a big commitment in the back, then I will just immediately apply quick pressure in the opposite lane. One thing to note, however, is that if your opponent is playing something like a beatdown deck, then I wouldn't actually recommend pressuring the opposite lane with your Ram Rider. Instead, I'll actually recommend that you save that Ram Rider for defense, because that Ram Rider snare is going to be very, very useful to have on a defensive end. Breaking down some other aspects of the defense, the Archer Queen is going to be the crux of your damage. That cloak ability is just so effective, and if the opponent doesn't have an immediate answer to her, she is going to absolutely tear apart the opponent's pushes. However, you also have things such as the E-Wiz, the Bandit, and the Royal Ghost, which are some quicker and cheaper options on defense, and of course the Mega Knight is there as your sort of big tank. One important thing to note is that the Archer Queen does die to spells such as the Lightning, so it's very important to space a lot of your defensive units out so that the opponent cannot get Lightning or other spell value on all of your units. Just like the Pekka Bridge Spam deck I shared earlier, the main goal is to have some sort of surviving units that you can use on a counter push. And with this deck, you can apply some very quick pressure. Bandit, Royal Ghost, and Bar Barrel are your 3 go-to pressure cards, and adding in a Ram Rider to a successful counter push is just going to be so hard for your opponents to stop. Finally, the Lightning is also essential to allowing your bridge spam pushes to break through. It's just so effective at taking out so many of the defensive units that are popular in this current meta. Number 4, Hog Lightning Cycle. Now this is sort of the new variation of Hog Earthquake Cycle, because let's be honest, you kind of just need the lightning spell in this meta if you want to survive. This is going to be a aggressive cycle deck. So starting out the match, I'm always going to be cycling some of my cheap cards, if not just cycling a Hog at the bridge. Being a quick Hog cycle deck, if you get a massive Hog connection to the opponent's tower, that's going to be great, but the main goal of this deck is to just get a single Hog hit or 2 onto the opponent's tower over and over again, eventually chipping your opponent's tower down to 0. The offensive pushes are going to be pretty self-explanatory. Of course, just sending in a lone Hog is generally going to be a pretty good option. Sometimes if the opponents have a building or some sort of other heavy counter, a Lightning will do very good at helping the Hog get to the opponent's tower. And your main objective on the offensive end is to try to constantly outcycle your opponent's Hog counters. On the defensive end is where this deck gets a little bit more difficult. Starting off, your first line of defense is always going to be offense. If the opponent has a big push coming in your way, sometimes it may be useful to throw a Hog in the opposite lane and force your opponent to actually spend elixir defending that push. This will oftentimes distract your opponents and actually give you some useful time and elixir to actually defend what your opponent has. But if all else fails, first off, you're going to want to cycle as many Teslas as possible. By playing the Tesla first in your defense, you're going to be able to cycle back to a second Tesla, which against certain decks is going to be very useful. Secondly, you want to make sure to play the Firecracker so that the opponent cannot get any spell value with her and the Tesla. In addition, you're going to want to protect the Firecracker and the Tesla with your Valkyrie, which is going to be your main mini tank, and use your other cycle units such as the Skeletons and the Fire Spirit as cheap distractions that'll help you cycle to more defensive options, such as a second Tesla, a second Firecracker, or a second Valkyrie. Lastly, it is very important to know how much damage your Lightning does. Being a cycle deck, once you get towards the triple elixir moments of the match, it may be useful to just switch to spell cycling, because you will oftentimes be able to cycle 2 or even 3 lightnings onto your opponent's tower at the end of these matches. Number 5, Lava Hound Spam. Now, Lava Hound has just always made my top 5 list, and as much as I hate to share it every single month, it is just one of the most effective and easy to play decks in this meta, so I'm gonna have to share it here. Starting off, however, it is important to note that this variation does have the guards as well as the tombstone, and that's actually because this meta has a lot more quick pressure and bridge spam, so it's very important when you play Lava Hound to keep in mind that your opponents are going to have some very quick pressure at the bridge for you to deal with. Starting off the match, however, the playstyle is still very, very aggressive. If I have the Lava Hound in cycle, I'll generally wait for my opponents to make play and then just Lava Hound in the same lane. Otherwise, then I'll just cycle something passive such as a Tombstone and then just wait and respond to what my opponents have. Starting off, breaking down the offense of this deck, it's going to be very, very simple. It's a very beatdown-esque style of push. However, I do really want to stress to not give the opponents too much spell value. I like to go in with sort of a mini push first, maybe support the Lava Hound with only one of your support units, and then once you bait out some of your opponent's counters, then go in with the remainder of your push. Now, while ideally with this deck, you're always going to be on the offensive end, building up these big pushes, there are also going to be times where you're going to have to pull off some amazing defenses. And I'll admit, with this being a Lava Hound deck, you only have 2 ground answers. However, the Tombstone and the guards are very effective at stalling your opponent's units, and the main goal is to sort of buy some time to allow your air units to actually damage down the opponent's pushes. The Skeleton Dragons and the Mega Minion both have insanely high damage output, so both of them will do a very, very good job on the defensive end, and you're also going to want to really utilize both the Fireball as well as the Zap to take care of the opponent's pushes as well. All in all, a very simple and aggressive style of deck to pick up. Not much else to say here.